Picture this. You're standing in the opulent throne room of ancient Egypt, watching as a 13-year-old girl trembles before the towering golden statue of Amun-Ra. The air is thick with incense and the weight of centuries-old tradition. Priests chant in voices that echo off marble walls, their words sealing a fate that will horrify you to your core. This young girl, barely more than a child, is about to become queen of the most powerful empire on earth. But the man she's being forced to marry isn't some foreign prince or political ally designed to strengthen Egypt's borders. No, the figure approaching her through the shadows, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, is someone far more disturbing. He shares her blood, her childhood memories, and her royal lineage. This is her brother, and their union will create one of history's most twisted tales of power, survival, and the devastating cost of absolute authority. Her name was Cleopatra VII, but not the famous one you're thinking of. This is the story of a different Cleopatra, one whose suffering has been buried beneath centuries of historical silence. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of ancient excess or political maneuvering. It's the story of how a civilization's most sacred traditions could transform family bonds into instruments of torture, and how one young woman's struggle for survival would reshape an empire. Before diving into this forgotten story of endurance and betrayal, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The year is 51 BCE, and Egypt stands at the crossroads of destiny. The Roman Republic grows stronger each day, casting hungry eyes toward the fertile Nile Delta and the unimaginable wealth that flows through Alexandria's harbours. Greek influence permeates every aspect of Egyptian court life, while the ancient pharaonic traditions struggle to maintain their grip on power. Into this volatile world steps an 18-year-old princess whose intelligence and ambition will soon make her one of history's most fascinating figures. But before she became the legendary seductress who captivated Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, before she ruled as the last pharaoh of an independent Egypt, Cleopatra VII was just a frightened teenager facing an impossible choice. Her father, Ptolemy Mnemosyne, lay dying in the royal palace, and with his death would come a succession crisis that threatened to tear the kingdom apart. The solution, dictated by 3 centuries of Ptolemaic tradition, was as simple as it was horrifying. She would marry her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy III, and together they would rule Egypt as co-pharaohs. This wasn't unusual by Egyptian standards. The Ptolemaic dynasty had practiced sibling marriage for generations, believing it kept the royal bloodline pure and prevented succession disputes. But for Cleopatra, raised with Greek tutors who had taught her about philosophy, mathematics, and the wider world beyond Egypt's borders, the prospect of marrying her own brother felt like a violation of everything she had been taught about civilization and human dignity. The marriage ceremony took place in the great temple of Ptah in Memphis, the ancient capital that had witnessed the coronation of pharaohs for over 3,000 years. Imagine the scene: massive columns carved with hieroglyphs stretching toward a ceiling painted with stars and sacred symbols, the air heavy with frankincense and myrrh, while hundreds of nobles and priests watch in reverent silence. At the center of it all, a young woman in golden robes stands beside a child who barely reaches her shoulder, both of them trapped in a ritual that will bind them together in ways that nature never intended. The high priest's voice echoes through the temple as he recites the ancient words that have sanctified royal unions since the time of the pyramids. But there's something different about this ceremony, something that makes even the most jaded courtiers shift uncomfortably in their seats. This isn't just a political marriage between distant relatives, as had been common in previous generations. This is a sister and brother, children of the same father and mother, being joined in a bond that will require them to produce heirs together. Cleopatra's hands shake as she accepts the ceremonial dagger that symbolizes her power to defend Egypt's borders. Ptolemy III, still a child, looks confused and frightened as priests place the double crown upon his head. The weight of it causes him to stumble, and for a moment, the carefully choreographed ceremony threatens to collapse into chaos. But Cleopatra steadies him, her protective instincts overriding her revulsion at the situation they've both been forced into. The crowd erupts in carefully orchestrated cheers as the new pharaohs turn to face their subjects. But behind the golden masks and elaborate makeup, two children are grappling with a reality that would challenge even the strongest adults. They are now husband and wife, brother and sister, co-rulers of an empire that spans from the cataracts of the Nile to the shores of the Mediterranean. The contradictions inherent in their situation will soon tear both their family and their kingdom apart. What made this particular sibling marriage so different from those that had come before? The answer lies in the personalities of the two young rulers and the impossible situation they inherited. Previous Ptolemaic marriages had often been marriages of convenience, with siblings ruling together while maintaining separate lives and interests. But Cleopatra VII was different. She was brilliant, ambitious, and determined to rule Egypt not just as a figurehead, but as a true pharaoh in the tradition of the great kings of the past. Her brother Ptolemy III, on the other hand, was still a child, easily manipulated by the powerful court advisors who saw an opportunity to control Egypt through a puppet king. Chief among these advisors was Pothinus, a cunning eunuch who had served Ptolemy XIII and now sought to eliminate Cleopatra's influence over the young pharaoh. Pothinus understood that as long as Cleopatra remained in the picture, his own power would be limited. He began immediately working to drive a wedge between the royal siblings. The first months of their joint reign were marked by an uneasy truce. Cleopatra, despite her revulsion at the marriage, tried to maintain a working relationship with her brother husband. She understood that Egypt's survival depended on presenting a united front to the world, particularly to the Romans who were watching events in Alexandria with keen interest. But every day brought new challenges to their already strained relationship. Court protocol demanded that they appear together at public ceremonies, sitting side by side on thrones that had been specifically designed to emphasize their equality as co-rulers. But the reality was far different. Cleopatra, 8 years older and infinitely more sophisticated than her brother, naturally took the lead in most discussions. She spoke fluent Greek, Latin, and several other languages, while Ptolemy III struggled with basic Egyptian. She had been educated in philosophy, mathematics, and statecraft while he was still learning to read and write. This disparity in their abilities created a natural tension that their advisors were quick to exploit. Pothinus and his allies whispered constantly in the young pharaoh's ear, telling him that his sister wife was trying to dominate him, that she had no respect for his authority as male heir to the throne. They reminded him of ancient precedents where pharaohs had ruled alone, without the interference of strong-willed queens. Meanwhile, Cleopatra found herself increasingly isolated at court. The nobles who had once supported her father now seemed to view her as a threat to the established order. Her intelligence, which had once been praised as a sign of divine favour, was now seen as dangerous and unwomanly. Her attempts to modernize Egypt's government and military were met with suspicion and resistance from traditionalists who preferred the old ways. The breaking point came during a dispute over grain distribution to the common people. Egypt had suffered a series of poor harvests, and the royal granaries were running dangerously low. Cleopatra proposed a radical solution: reduce the grain rations given to the temples and wealthy nobles, and redirect those resources to feed the hungry masses. She argued that a pharaoh's first duty was to protect the people, not to maintain the privileges of the elite. Ptolemy Thund, influenced by his advisors, rejected the proposal outright. He declared that the temples were sacred and that reducing their offerings would anger the gods. The confrontation that followed would be remembered as the moment when their fragile partnership finally shattered beyond repair. The argument began in the private chambers they were forced to share as husband and wife, a room that had become a battlefield of whispered accusations and barely contained rage. Cleopatra stood before the great window overlooking the harbour, watching Roman ships dock with supplies that Egypt desperately needed but could barely afford. Her brother husband sat hunched on the edge of their shared bed, his small frame dwarfed by the elaborate golden headboard carved with images of their ancestors. "You don't understand what you're asking," Ptolemy XIII said, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to sound authoritative. The priests have served our family for centuries. They won't accept having their privileges stripped away by a woman who thinks she knows better than tradition." Cleopatra turned from the window, her dark eyes flashing with a fury that made even the guards stationed outside their door step back. "A woman? I am your queen, your co-ruler, and in case you've forgotten, your wife. When our people are starving in the streets while priests feast on offerings meant for the gods, tradition becomes irrelevant." The young pharaoh's face flushed red, but before he could respond, the chamber doors burst open. Pothinus entered without ceremony, his silk robes rustling as he moved with the calculated grace of a man who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of court politics. Behind him came Achilles, the general who commanded Egypt's army, and Arsinoe, Cleopatra's younger sister, whose ambitious eyes had been watching the growing conflict with keen interest. "Your Majesties," Pothinus said, bowing just deeply enough to show respect without appearing subservient. "I regret interrupting your private discussion, but urgent matters require your attention. The Roman Senator Pompey has sent word that he may seek sanctuary in Egypt. His war with Julius Caesar has taken a dire turn, and he may soon arrive at our shores seeking refuge." Cleopatra's mind raced as she processed this information. Pompey's arrival would force Egypt to choose sides in Rome's civil war, a decision that could determine the kingdom's fate for generations. But she also recognized the interruption for what it was: a deliberate attempt by Pothinus to prevent her from winning the argument about grain distribution. Every time she tried to implement meaningful reforms, some new crisis would conveniently arise to derail her efforts. "We should welcome Pompey," Ptolemy then declared, clearly reciting words that had been carefully rehearsed. "He has been a friend to Egypt in the past, and supporting him against Caesar demonstrates our loyalty to Rome's established order." "And if Caesar wins?" Cleopatra asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "What happens to Egypt when the victorious general discovers we harbored his greatest enemy? You're gambling with our kingdom's survival based on the advice of men who have never faced a Roman legion in battle." Achilles stepped forward, his scarred face set in grim lines. "Your Majesty, with respect. Caesar is thousands of miles away fighting in Gaul. Pompey's forces control the Mediterranean, and his navy could blockade our ports if we refuse him sanctuary. The choice is clear." But Cleopatra saw through the general's confident facade. She had been studying reports from her spies in Rome, and she knew that Caesar's star was rising while Pompey's was beginning to wane. More importantly, she understood that this decision about Pompey was really about something far more fundamental: who would truly rule Egypt. "I will not make this decision hastily," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone born to command. "We will convene the full royal council tomorrow morning to discuss our options. Until then, no commitments will be made to anyone." Pothinus exchanged a meaningful glance with Achilles, and Cleopatra knew that her brother-husband was about to be pushed into open defiance. The moment she had been dreading since their marriage was finally at hand, the moment when their advisors would force them to choose between family loyalty and political survival. "Actually, sister," Ptolemy Thern said, his young voice trembling with nervous energy, "I believe we should decide this matter now. As pharaoh, I have the authority to make decisions regarding foreign policy, and I choose to welcome Pompey to Egypt." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the chamber understood that this wasn't just about Roman politics, it was a direct challenge to Cleopatra's authority as co-ruler. By making a unilateral decision on such a crucial matter, her brother-husband was essentially declaring that he intended to rule alone. Cleopatra felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach. She had known this moment would come, but she had hoped to delay it until she could build stronger support among the nobility and the people. Now, faced with a direct challenge to her authority, she had to choose between submission and open conflict with her own family. "You forget yourself, brother," she said, her voice carrying a warning that everyone in the room could hear. "We rule together as equals. No decision of this magnitude can be made without my consent." Arsinoe, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, chose this moment to speak. "Perhaps it would be wise to consider what the people want," she said, her voice carrying the false sweetness of someone who had been waiting for this opportunity. "The common folk remember the old stories of pharaohs who ruled alone, without the complications of shared power. They might welcome a return to traditional ways." Cleopatra turned to stare at her younger sister, seeing the naked ambition in her eyes. Arsinoe was only 16, but she had clearly been planning this moment for months. The realization hit Cleopatra like a physical blow. She wasn't just facing opposition from her brother husband's advisors. Her own family was turning against her. Traditional ways? Cleopatra repeated, her voice rising with anger. You mean the traditional way that has seen Egypt become a Roman client state? The traditional way that has left our people hungry while foreign merchants grow rich in our ports? If that's what you consider wisdom, then perhaps you should study history more carefully. The confrontation was spiraling out of control, and everyone in the chamber could feel the tension building toward an explosive climax. Ptolemy Thebes looked back and forth between his wife and his sister, clearly overwhelmed by the forces he had unleashed. Pothinus watched with the satisfaction of a man whose carefully laid plans were finally bearing fruit. "Enough!" Achilles shouted, his soldiers' instincts taking over as he sensed the situation becoming dangerous. This is not how pharaohs should behave in front of their servants. If you cannot agree on policy, then perhaps Egypt needs a different solution. The general's words hung in the air like a threat, and Cleopatra understood that she was witnessing the beginning of a coup. Her brother husband's advisors weren't just trying to influence policy, they were planning to remove her from power entirely. The marriage that was supposed to unite the kingdom was instead becoming the instrument of its destruction. "You dare threaten your queen," Cleopatra said, her voice carrying the full weight of 3 centuries of Ptolemaic authority. "I am the daughter of Ptolemy the Thebes, the heir to Alexander's legacy and the chosen of the gods. No general, no advisor, and no frightened child wearing a crown too heavy for his head will dictate terms to me." But even as she spoke these defiant words, Cleopatra knew that her position was becoming untenable. She was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and increasingly isolated from the sources of power that had once protected her. The brother she had been forced to marry was now her enemy, manipulated by advisors who saw her as an obstacle to their own ambitions. The young queen straightened her shoulders and walked toward the chamber doors, her royal bearing intact despite the chaos surrounding her. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break, not when so much depended on projecting strength in the face of overwhelming opposition. "This discussion is over," she announced, her voice carrying across the marble halls. "But remember this moment, all of you. When Egypt lies in ruins because of your short-sighted ambitions, when Roman legions march through Alexandria's streets because you chose the wrong side in their civil war, remember that you had the chance to listen to wisdom and chose instead to follow fear." As the chamber doors closed behind her, Cleopatra walked through the marble corridors of the palace she had called home since childhood, but now every shadow seemed to conceal a potential enemy. The servants who had once bowed deeply when she passed now averted their eyes, uncertain of where their loyalties should lie. Word of the confrontation had already begun to spread through the palace, and she could hear whispered conversations falling silent as she approached. In her private study, surrounded by scrolls containing the wisdom of centuries, Cleopatra finally allowed herself to acknowledge the full scope of her predicament. The marriage that had been forced upon her was now the very mechanism being used to destroy her. Her brother husband, barely more than a child, had been transformed into a weapon by advisors who understood that controlling him meant controlling Egypt. The irony was suffocating. She had been raised to believe that sibling marriage was a sacred tradition that preserved the purity of the royal bloodline and prevented succession disputes. Instead, it had created the perfect conditions for civil war. By binding her fate to a brother who could be manipulated by ambitious courtiers, the ancient customs had made her more vulnerable, not less. That night, as she lay in the bed, she was forced to share with her brother husband. Cleopatra stared at the ceiling and planned her next move. Ptolemy Thebes slept fitfully beside her, occasionally murmuring in his dreams about battles and crowns. She wondered if he truly understood what his advisors were asking him to do, or if he was simply a frightened child trying to please the adults who surrounded him with their whispered promises and threats. The decision about Pompey would be made with or without her consent, she realized. Pothinus and Achilles had already chosen their course, and they would use her brother's authority to legitimize whatever action they deemed necessary. Her only choice was whether to submit to their will or to fight for her rightful place as pharaoh. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Pompey's ships had been spotted approaching the Egyptian coast, and the Roman general was requesting immediate sanctuary. The royal council convened an emergency session, but Cleopatra quickly realized that the debate was a mere formality. Her husband's advisors had already made their decision, and they were simply going through the motions of consultation. "The great Pompey has been a friend to Egypt," Pothinus declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had already won the argument. "We cannot abandon him in his hour of need without damaging our reputation throughout the Mediterranean world." Cleopatra listened to the familiar rhetoric with growing frustration. These men spoke of honor and friendship, but she could see the calculation behind their words. They believed that supporting Pompey would align Egypt with Rome's established power structure, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the conflict consuming the Roman world. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice cutting through the ceremonial politeness that characterized these councils. "Caesar isn't just another ambitious general. He represents something new, something that will reshape the entire Mediterranean. By opposing him, you're not just choosing the wrong side, you're choosing the losing side." Aquila stood to respond, his scarred face set in grim determination. "Your Majesty, Caesar may be a capable commander, but he lacks the resources and political connections that have made Pompey great. The Senate supports Pompey, the established families support him, and most importantly, the gods favor him. Egypt should align itself with divine will, not with the ambitions of an upstart who seeks to destroy Rome's ancient traditions." The general's words revealed the fundamental flaw in their thinking. They were viewing Caesar through the lens of traditional Roman politics, failing to understand that he represented a complete break with the past. Cleopatra had studied Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, had read his dispatches and analyzed his strategies. She understood that he wasn't just seeking power. He was creating an entirely new form of government that would make the old Roman Republic obsolete. But her insights fell on deaf ears. The council voted to welcome Pompey to Egypt, and Ptolemy III sealed the decision with the royal seal that he now claimed to control exclusively. As the meeting dispersed, Cleopatra realized that she was no longer just witnessing a political dispute. She was watching the systematic dismantling of everything she had been raised to believe about rulership and authority. The final betrayal came 3 days later, when Pompey's ships arrived at the mouth of the Nile. Instead of the grand reception that had been promised, the Roman general was met by a small boat containing Achillas and a handful of soldiers. What happened next would haunt Cleopatra for the rest of her life and demonstrate the true depths of her advisor's cynicism. As Pompey stepped into the boat, believing he was being escorted to safety, Achillas drew his sword and struck him down. The great Roman general, who had conquered much of the known world, died in the shallow waters of the Nile Delta, murdered by the very people who had promised him sanctuary. His head was severed and presented to Ptolemy III as proof of Egypt's loyalty to whoever emerged victorious from Rome's civil war. When news of the assassination reached the palace, Cleopatra felt a mixture of horror and despair that went beyond mere political calculation. She had disagreed with the decision to welcome Pompey, but she had never imagined that her husband's advisors would resort to cold-blooded murder. The act violated every principle of hospitality and honor that had governed relations between civilized nations for centuries. "You've doomed us all," she told Pothinus when he arrived to report the success of his plan. "Do you think Caesar will thank you for murdering his rival? Do you think any leader will ever trust Egypt again after this betrayal?" The eunuch's smile was cold and calculating. "Caesar will appreciate our pragmatism and fear our ruthlessness. Egypt has demonstrated that we choose our friends carefully and eliminate our enemies efficiently. What more could a conqueror ask for in an ally?" But Cleopatra understood what Pothinus refused to acknowledge, that Caesar was not just another Roman general seeking temporary advantage. He was a man who valued honor and despised treachery, who would see Pompey's murder not as a gift, but as a warning about Egypt's unreliability. The assassination had not solved their problems. It had created new ones that would soon threaten the very survival of the kingdom. The crisis came to a head when Caesar himself arrived in Alexandria, pursuing Pompey's fleeing forces. Instead of the gratitude that Pothinus had expected, the Roman general was disgusted by the severed head that was presented to him as a trophy. Caesar wept for his fallen rival and declared that the murderers had dishonored both Rome and Egypt with their treachery. Cleopatra saw her opportunity in Caesar's reaction. While her brother husband and his advisors scrambled to justify their actions, she began planning a desperate gambit that would either restore her to power or result in her death. She would bypass the palace guards and the court officials who had turned against her, and appeal directly to Caesar himself. The famous story of how she had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence wrapped in a carpet has become the stuff of legend, but the reality was far more complex and dangerous than the romantic tales suggest. Cleopatra was gambling everything on her ability to convince the most powerful man in the world that she represented Egypt's future, while her brother represented its past. When she emerged from the carpet in Caesar's private chambers, she was not just a beautiful woman seeking protection, she was a desperate queen fighting for her life and her kingdom. The conversation that followed would determine not only her personal fate, but the future of Egypt itself. Caesar, seasoned by decades of political intrigue, immediately understood the situation. Here was a young woman of obvious intelligence and determination, trapped in a marriage that had become a prison and betrayed by the very people who should have protected her. Her willingness to risk everything to reach him demonstrated both courage and desperation in equal measure. "You are the elder sibling," Caesar observed, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of her appearance and manner. "By rights, you should rule Egypt alone. Why do you share power with advisors who clearly do not respect your authority?" Cleopatra's answer would echo through history. "Because, great Caesar, I have been bound by traditions that were created to preserve our dynasty, but have instead become the instruments of its destruction. I seek not just your protection, but your partnership in creating a new future for Egypt, one that honors the past while embracing the possibilities of tomorrow." The alliance that formed between Cleopatra and Caesar would reshape the ancient world, but it began with a young woman's desperate attempt to escape a marriage that had become a trap. In Caesar, she found not just a powerful protector, but a kindred spirit who understood that true leadership required the courage to break with tradition when tradition became an obstacle to progress. The civil war that followed would tear Egypt apart, pitting brother against sister in a conflict that would end with Ptolemy the Mythern's death and Cleopatra's emergence as sole ruler. But the scars of that forced marriage would remain with her forever, shaping her understanding of power and her determination never again to allow her fate to be decided by others. In the end, the queen who was forced to marry her brother became the woman who chose her own destiny, transforming a personal tragedy into a triumph that would inspire generations of leaders who refused to accept the limitations that others tried to impose upon them. Her story reminds us that even in the darkest moments when tradition and circumstance seem to offer no escape, the human spirit can find a way to break free and create something new and extraordinary from the ashes of what came before.